Welcome. Tonight, we descend into the humid, clanking heart of the Iron Tide. We follow Bram, a low-ranking alchemist trapped in the sweltering, oil-slicked belly of a war-galley, as it attempts to grind its way through a swamp that refuses to be conquered. It is a story of cold steel against ancient silt, and the high cost of maintaining an artificial flame in a world that breathes through the mud. Settle in, and please, remember to like and subscribe if you find yourself drawn to the darkness of the machine. Let the furnace burn. The belly of the war galley, grimly christened the Cinder Heart, was a cavernous nightmare of screaming iron, pressurized steam, and a sweltering heat so absolute it felt like a physical blow to the chest with every breath. Bram wiped a thick, cloying mixture of salt sweat, charcoal dust, and industrial grease from his stinging eyes, his fingers trembling with a fine mechanical palsy as he adjusted the heavy brass valve on the primary fuel line. He was a low-ranking alchemist of the Third Order, a man whose entire existence had been reduced to the health and temperamental nature of the Everflame, the artificial heart that powered the massive, steel-plated behemoth through the thick muck of the world's edge. The heat in the engine room was a heavy, throbbing presence that seemed to vibrate in his very teeth, a constant low-frequency roar that muffled the world outside until it was nothing but a distant memory. Beyond the thick, riveted hull of the ship lay the great Silt Marsh, a vast, clogged expanse of ancient mud, stinking sulfurous gas, and strangling vines that the Empire sought to tame with the blunt instruments of fire and iron. Bram could hear the swamp fighting back against their intrusion, the sound of the massive, rotating iron paddle wheels grinding against submerged roots that were as hard as petrified bone and as stubborn as the earth itself. The ship groaned, a long, shuddering sound of tortured metal that made the floor plates beneath his iron-shod boots buckle and heave like the deck of a dying whale in the shallows. He checked the primary pressure gauge for the 100th time that hour, the needle dancing erratically in the flickering, unnatural orange light of the main furnace. The Everflame was hungry, demanding a constant, uninterrupted flow of distilled naphtha, refined sulfur, and specialized alchemical salts to keep the massive pistons churning. Bram adjusted the flow with a heavy wrench, his ears ringing with the relentless, clanking rhythm of the machinery that had become his only music in this sunless tomb. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a cold, calculated pulse that stood in stark defiance of the wet, chaotic silence of the ancient marsh outside. He thought of the druidic circle that lay somewhere ahead in the choking fog, a place of soft moss, damp earth, and old magic, and wondered how their fragile organic world could possibly survive the arrival of the Iron Tide. He reached for a heavy iron shovel, scooping a fresh pile of salts into the furnace, the flare of green light reflecting in his hollow, sunken eyes. He was a servant of the machine, a minor cog in a vast steel engine of invasion, and he could feel the swamp watching him through the thick hull, waiting for a single momentary lapse in the boiler's pressure. He felt the weight of the Empire on his shoulders, a weight made of coal, iron, and blood, and it was crushing the breath out of him, one piston stroke at a time, as they ground deeper into the green dark. The air in the lower decks was so thick with pressurized steam and oil smoke that it felt like breathing warm, liquid lead, a sensation that left a bitter metallic film on the back of Bram's throat that no amount of water could wash away. He moved through the narrow, cramped walkways with the practiced, shuffling gait of a man who spent his life in the dark, avoiding the scalding pipes that lined the walls like the exposed veins of a titan. Every surface was slick with a fine black film of lubricant, and the walls were perpetually weeping with heavy condensation that tasted of salt, rust, and ancient iron. He reached the secondary compression chamber, where the steam was recycled back into the primary boiler, and found a dangerous leak in the main gasket. A thin, white plume of high-pressure steam was hissing into the air with a sound like 1,000 angry vipers, threatening to peel the skin from his face if he moved too quickly. Bram grabbed a heavy, iron-handled wrench, his muscles screaming with exhaustion as he fought to tighten the red-hot bolts against the vibrating, shuddering force of the engine. The Cinderheart hit something massive in the water, perhaps a ridge of stone or a cluster of petrified trees, and the entire ship lurched violently to the port side with a sickening crunch. Bram was thrown against the hot bulkhead, the smell of singed wool and burnt flesh filling the small, enclosed space as his arm made contact with a steam pipe. He did not scream. He did not have the breath or the luxury for it. He simply pushed himself back up, his fingers raw and stinging, and returned to the gasket with a grim, silent determination. The ship was a monster of steel, a clanking, clumsy invader in a world of water and silt, and it required constant, agonizing maintenance to keep from being swallowed by the hungry earth. He could hear the paddle wheels outside, the sound muffled by a thick layer of mud that was now coating the hull like a heavy burial shroud. It was a slow, wet, slurping sound, the swamp attempting to create a vacuum that would pull the ship down into the lightless, suffocating depths where the iron would rust in peace. Bram felt a sudden sharp chill, a draft of cold, damp air that had no business being in the heart of a furnace room. He looked down and saw a thin, dark trickle of silt water oozing through a seam in the floor plates. It was not a mechanical leak. It was a probe, a wet, searching finger of the marsh, testing the integrity of the Empire's steel and finding it wanting. He stomped on the seam, his heavy iron-shod boot clanging against the floor, but the water continued to rise, a slow, dark pool that smelled of ancient decay, dead things, and the salt of a forgotten sea that had once covered this land before the trees took hold. Hours bled into a single, unending cycle of heat, pressure, and the relentless metallic roar of the Everflame, until Bram's mind began to fray at the edges like a tattered banner. He was beginning to see patterns in the shifting steam, ghostly shifting shapes that looked like the swaying branches of the trees he had not seen in many weeks. The whispers of the machinery had changed, the steady clanking rhythm replaced by a wet, gurgling sound that suggested the pipes were filling with something much thicker and more alive than water. He checked the primary intake filter, a massive brass-gridded drum that strained the marsh water before it entered the cooling system. What he found there made the fine hair on his arms stand up, despite the sweltering heat of the boiler room. The filter was clogged, not with silt, stones, or weeds, but with long, silky strands of hair that looked like human tresses, only green, slimy, and shimmering with an oily, unnatural light. Bram reached in with a pair of long iron tongs, pulling the mass out with a grimace of disgust that twisted his soot-stained face. It pulsed in the tongs, a living, throbbing clump of organic matter that seemed to breathe in the stale, oily air. He dropped it into the waste bin, but as he turned back to the filter, the hair began to crawl out of the bin, moving with the slow, determined grace of a predatory eel. The swamp was no longer just fighting the ship from the outside. It was infiltrating it, becoming part of the very plumbing and spirit of the vessel. Bram felt the pressure in the boiler begin to spike dangerously, the needle on the gauge hitting the red zone with a sharp, audible click that sounded like a death sentence in the dark. He ran toward the safety valve, his boots splashing through the dark water that was now ankle-deep on the floor plates. The water was cold, bitterly cold, a stark and terrifying contrast to the sweltering, oppressive heat of the engine room air. He yanked on the heavy safety chain with all his strength, but it would not budge an inch. Something was holding it from within the mechanism, something wet, soft, and incredibly strong. He looked up through the swirling steam and saw a figure standing in the shadows behind the main boiler. A woman wrapped in a cloak of dripping moss, her eyes two shining orbs of pale phosphorescent green that cut through the darkness like twin stars. It was the Silt-Witch, the guardian of the circle they had come to destroy, and she was standing in the very heart of the machine that was meant to kill her. She did not speak. She simply reached out a pale hand, and the iron pipes beneath her fingers began to rust, flake, and crumble into red, powdery dust at an impossible, magical speed that defied every alchemical law Bram had ever studied. The engine room erupted into a total chaos of white, blinding steam and spraying oil as the pipes disintegrated under the Silt-Witch's silent, terrible touch. Bram threw his scarred arm over his face, protecting his eyes from the scalding, burning mist as he scrambled back toward the safety of the primary furnace door. The Everflame was roaring now, the green light turning a violent, angry shade of violet as it reacted to the presence of the powerful druidic magic. The ship was dying. The iron tide was being stemmed by the very silt it sought to conquer and pave over for the glory of the Empire. Bram grabbed a heavy alchemical fire extinguisher, a brass cylinder filled with pressurized sand and neutralizing salts, and aimed it at the figure shrouded in the moss. But she was already gone, dissolving into a cloud of dark, damp spores that smelled of fresh rain, turned earth, and old, unmarked graves. The water on the floor was rising faster now, a cold, dark tide that was beginning to extinguish the lower fires and drown the smaller gears. Bram knew that if the Everflame went out completely and the temperature dropped too fast, the pressure in the primary boiler would backfire, turning the entire ship into a massive, steel shrapnel bomb that would kill everyone on board in a single heartbeat. He ignored the safety valves and the crumbling, rusting pipes, focusing all his fading, desperate energy on the furnace itself. He shoveled in more salts, more naphtha, his movements frantic, jerky, and pained as he fought to keep the artificial heart beating just a few minutes longer. He could hear the screams of the sailors on the upper decks, the sounds of ironclad boots running across the iron plating in a blind panic, and the wet, slapping sound of the marsh creatures climbing over the railings. The invasion had become a massacre, the cold, clanking machinery no match for the slow, relentless, and biological power of the ancient marsh. He was alone in the dark, a low-ranking alchemist with a rusted shovel, trying to save a monster that was already half submerged in the thick silt. He felt the ship tilt further to the port side, a deep, grinding lurch that told him the hull had finally been breached by the massive underwater roots of the swamp. The water reached his knees, icy and thick, dragging at his movements like a lead weight as he threw the final heavy bag of sulfur into the green fire. He felt the ship groan one last time, a sound of absolute defeat that vibrated through the very marrow of his bones as the steel gave way to the mud. The furnace roared one final time, a massive, blinding burst of emerald light that cut through the thick steam and the oil smoke like a physical blade. For a single shining second, Bram could see the engine room with a clarity that was terrifying in its detail. It was a nightmare of rusted iron and emerald vines, the walls covered in a thick, pulsing carpet of moss that was rapidly consuming the machinery and the brass fittings as if they were nothing more than compost. The Silt-Witch was there again, standing directly in front of the open furnace door, her moss cloak fanning out like the wings of a predatory bird of the night. She looked at Bram, not with hatred, but with a deep, melancholy curiosity, as if she were studying a strange metallic insect that had wandered into her sacred garden. She reached out and touched the furnace door, and the heavy iron casting turned into soft green leaves in an instant, the metal yielding to her touch like wax beneath a flame. The ever-flame did not explode as Bram had feared. It simply changed its fundamental nature. The fire turned into a swirling cloud of glowing green butterflies, thousands of them, bursting out of the furnace and filling the engine room with a soft, shimmering, and impossible light. They flew through the steam, dissolving the smoke, and as they touched the iron walls, the steel turned back into the earth, the ore, and the stone from which it had been mined centuries ago. Bram stood in the center of the transformation, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his lungs finally filling with cool, sweet, damp air for the first time in months. He felt the cinder heart settle into the mud, not with a crash, but with a soft, yielding sigh, as the entire ship began to turn back into a ridge of stone, soil, and blooming wildflowers. He looked at his hands. The coal dust and grease were being washed away by the rising water, leaving his skin clean, pale, and strangely smooth in the emerald light. The machinery was gone, the clanking, screaming noise of the engine replaced by the soft, lapping sound of the water against the new moss. He was no longer an alchemist of the machine. He was a witness to the return of the wild, the moment the world decided to breathe again. He looked at the Silt-Witch, but she was already walking away through the trees that had sprouted from the deck, her mossy feet leaving no ripples on the surface of the dark, still water as she vanished into the green. The transition from the sweltering artificial heat of the engine room to the damp, cool silence of the transformed ship was a shock to Bram's overtaxed system, leaving him lightheaded and weak. He stood waist-deep in the water, his heavy iron-shod boots now sinking into a floor that felt more like river clay than iron plating. The Cinder Heart was no longer a war-galley. It was a long, serrated island of stone and blooming greenery, the jagged edges of the hull now softened by blankets of thick, shimmering moss and small white flowers. Above him, the iron ceiling had vanished entirely, replaced by a canopy of ancient weeping willows whose long branches hung down like protective curtains of silk. Bram looked up and saw the stars for the first time in many months, tiny pinprick diamonds scattered across a sky that was a deep, perfect, and velvet blue. The screams of the sailors had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, tranquil chorus of frogs and the soft whirring sound of dragonflies dancing over the water. He realized with a strange, hollow sense of relief that the iron tide had been completely erased, not by fire or sword, but by a slow, relentless, and beautiful return to the natural order. He began to wade through the water, moving toward the edge of what had once been the engine room, his movements slow and reverent. He found his heavy iron wrench half buried in the mud, but when he picked it up, the metal felt light, porous, and fragile, like petrified wood that had been hollowed by time. It was a relic of a dead world, a piece of a nightmare that was rapidly dissolving into the morning mist. He let it drop back into the water, the soft splash echoing through the silent moonlit swamp like a final goodbye to the Empire. He reached the edge of the ship island and saw the marsh stretching out in every direction, a vast, glimmering expanse of water, silver-tipped grass, and the silhouettes of ancient trees. The Empire was gone, the steam and steel machinery a forgotten dream in the face of the silt and the tide. He felt a sudden, sharp sense of freedom, a massive weight lifting from his chest that he had not even realized he was carrying for all these years of service. He was no longer a servant of the machine. He was a survivor of the world's quiet, persistent, and total revenge against those who sought to pave it over. Bram found a dry patch of earth near the center of the ship island, where a massive oak had already begun to take root with impossible speed, and sat down, his legs finally giving way under the weight of his exhaustion. He watched as a group of small, glowing spirits, tiny flickers of emerald light, began to dance among the willow branches above him. They were the remnants of the Everflame, the artificial fire now liberated and turned back into a natural, pulsing energy of the earth. He thought of the alchemists back in the capital, the men who spent their lives trying to cage the fire, trying to force the world into a rigid, metallic, and profitable mold that served only the gears. They would never understand this, the beauty of the decay, the grace of the forest as it reclaimed its own stolen materials. He looked at his clothes, the heavy, greasy leather apron and the iron-shod boots, and felt a sudden violent urge to be rid of them for good. He unbuckled the straps with fumbling fingers, shedding the uniform of the Iron Tide, like a snake shedding its skin at the end of a long, dark season. He stood there in the moonlight, a man made of flesh and bone, no longer defined by his rank, his duty, or his service to the machine. He felt the cool mud between his toes, soft and yielding, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt connected to the ground beneath him instead of the vibrating steel deck. He began to walk, not back toward the capital and its screaming city factories, but deeper into the marsh, following the path of the glowing spirits. He did not know where he was going, but he knew that the swamp would provide what he needed to survive. It was a world that breathed, a world that remembered, and it had chosen to let him live while the others were swallowed by the silt. He passed the remains of a heavy steam-powered cannon, now a moss-covered boulder where a family of water birds had already built their nest in the muzzle. The iron was gone, the steel was gone, only the silt and the life it supported remained in the end. He felt the air, clean and cold, filling his lungs, and he knew he was finally home, among the shadows and the reeds. The walk through the marsh was a slow, dreamlike journey through a world that seemed to be made entirely of silver and shadow. Bram moved with a new, fluid grace, his senses sharpened by the absolute absence of the engine's roar and the smell of sulfur. He could hear the tiny scratching sound of a beetle on a leaf, the soft, sliding movement of a snake through the tall grass, the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the earth's own heartbeat beneath his feet. The Silt-Witch appeared again, standing on a hummock of dry land beneath a massive, gnarled cypress tree that looked 1,000 years old. She was no longer a terrifying figure of spores and moss. She looked like a woman made of the marsh itself, her skin the color of river clay, her hair a tangled mass of green vines and small white flowers that smelled of honey and rain. She watched him approach, her green eyes reflecting the soft light of the glowing spirits that followed him like pets. "The machine is dead," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry reeds in a summer breeze, a sound that carried no weight of command or malice. "The iron has returned to the stone, the steam has returned to the mist, and the world is at peace once more." Bram nodded slowly, his voice a low, rasping whisper that still carried the grit of the engine room. "I know. I was its servant, and I was its prisoner for too many years." The Silt-Witch smiled, a slow, sad curve of her lips that held no malice, but much wisdom. "You are its prisoner, little alchemist, but the prison has dissolved into the silt, and the doors are open for those who wish to walk through them." She reached out and handed him a small, wooden bowl filled with clear, cool water that looked like liquid silver. He drank it, the liquid tasting of rain, moss, and old hidden springs, and felt a surge of strength flow through his tired, aching limbs. He realized then that he was not just a survivor of a wreck, he was a guest of the marsh. The Druidic Circle had not just destroyed the invaders, it had invited the survivors to become part of the new world, to help it heal from the iron scars. He looked back one last time toward the distant horizon, where the black smoke of the Empire's factories still stained the sky like a bruise, and then he turned his back on it forever. The days that followed were a blur of green light, soft, damp shadows, and the slow, steady work of restoration and growth. Bram learned the secrets of the marsh, the way the water flowed in invisible, ancient patterns, the way the roots communicated through the silt, the way the glowing spirits kept the darkness at bay. He worked with the Druidic Circle, not with iron, fire, or acid, but with seeds, soil, and the patience of the seasons. He found that his alchemical knowledge, once used to maintain a destructive artificial flame, could be used to encourage growth, to purify the water, to help the marsh expand and flourish over the ruins of the invasion. He was no longer a man of steam and steel. He was a man of silt and spirit, his hands now stained with the green of leaves instead of the black of coal. The capital of the Empire was far away, a distant, crumbling memory of a world that was trying to build a cage for the sun and a box for the wind. Here the sun was a friend, a warm golden hand that reached down through the willows to touch the earth and bless the water. Bram watched as the ship island grew and changed, becoming a sanctuary for the creatures of the marsh, a place where the iron had been completely forgotten by everyone except the stones. He felt a deep, abiding sense of peace, a stillness in his soul that the machine could never provide, regardless of its power or speed. He was a part of the circle now, a protector of the wet, claustrophobic beauty of the marsh, and a witness to its quiet, unstoppable strength. He spent his evenings sitting on the edge of the stone ridge that had once been the prow of the Cinderheart, listening to the frogs and watching the dragonflies, his heart beating in sync with the slow, relentless, and eternal rhythm of the silt. He was alive, he was free, and he was finally at rest in a world that didn't need a furnace to be warm. Many years later, a new expedition from the Empire reached the edge of the Great Silt Marsh, their ironclad boots trampling the wildflowers of the meadow. They were led by a young, ambitious general in a suit of shining, steam-powered armor, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Druidic Circle lay, untapped and unconquered. He looked out over the marsh and saw nothing but water, weeds, and fog, a vast, empty expanse that he intended to pave over and conquer with his new, improved machines of war. He did not see the ridge of moss-covered stone in the distance. He did not see the glowing spirits dancing among the willows. He did not see the man standing in the shadows of a cypress tree, his skin the color of river clay, his eyes a deep, phosphorescent green. He gave the loud, clanking order to advance, and the massive iron paddle wheels began to churn the mud, the engine screaming with a cold, calculated, and mechanical fury. But as the first ship entered the marsh, the water began to rise, a slow, dark tide that smelled of rain and ancient decay. The paddle wheels hit something solid, a massive underwater root that was as hard as ironwood, and the ship groaned, a long, shuddering sound of tortured metal that predicted its own end. In a sweltering belly of the ship, a young, terrified alchemist wiped a thick, greasy mixture of sweat and coal dust from his eyes, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the brass valve on the primary fuel line. He did not know that the swamp was already dreaming of him, tasting the salt of his sweat, the rhythm of his heart. He did not know that the iron tide was already stems, and that the Silt-Witch was waiting in the shadows, ready to turn his steel into stone and his fire into a cloud of butterflies. The cycle was beginning again, as it always does when men try to box the wild. But the marsh was patient, the marsh was ancient, and the marsh always won in the end. Bram watched the new ship struggle, a small, sad smile on his face as he raised his hand to the wind and felt the silt rise to meet the iron one more time. The debt of the Empire was still being paid, one coordinate at a time. The iron tide has been stems, and the Silt-Witch has reclaimed her domain. Thank you for staying until the final clank of the machinery and the first breath of the marsh. If you found yourself lost in the steam and the moss, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the Empire. Remember, the machine may scream, but the marsh simply breathes. Until next time, stay clear of the silt and keep your flame natural.